Good day to you. I'm Adrian Usher, and between 2016 and 2021, I was the commander in the Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command, in charge of delivering protection. Good day to you, and thank you very much for inviting me to give a couple of minutes of a change programme which I introduced in 2017 onwards. Being in charge of protection nationally meant that I was responsible for the devising and delivery of close protection tactics, both at home and overseas, to all those ministers and members of the royal family who received close protection services. And I was also responsible for the physical protection of all royal palaces, including Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle and Balmoral in Scotland, amongst many others, and all diplomatic and consular premises within London, and also the protection of the Palace of Westminster, more commonly known as the House of Commons. And it was at those premises in March 2017 that I lost an officer. PC Keith Palmer was murdered by Khalid Masood, who had killed 4 people on Westminster Bridge with a vehicle attack, and then had entered the Palace of Westminster on foot and with a low sophistication knife attack killed Keith before he was shot and killed by another one of my officers. So the number of diplomatic premises that I protected in London changed on an almost daily basis due to changing world events, emerging threats, and the dissipation of those threats over time. It was a daily consideration as to which embassies would receive physical protection. But during my 5 years, there were a core of 7 embassies that always received physical protection. And I'm not giving away, I don't think, any state secrets to say that Israel was one of those embassies. And what that protection looked like was that there would be a number, as you would imagine, of technical measures that we would install, intruder alarms, trigger alarms, CCTV, and a variety of other technical pieces of equipment. And that was almost always actually considerably surpassed by what the embassy themselves installed for their own protection. But it also included 2 uniformed armed officers, almost always deployed at the front of the embassy. Those of us who work in the security environment know that it is an environment of almost perpetual change. There are new and emerging threat and tactics deployed and innovated by terrorists across the world. There are new technologies available both to terrorists and to security forces to counter and mitigate those threats. And there are new tactics and skills of our training methods of our own staff. It is a world of constant change and constant review. But for a variety of reasons, in 2017, I initiated a review into how we delivered protection at diplomatic premises. And it was really born of a simple thought, and that was, it seemed evident to me that a really, really predictable and visible physical presence at the front of an embassy was in fact also really vulnerable. The guards would be standing very often on the street or very close to the street, and passing individuals had ready access to them, and a low sophistication attack could, in my view, mean that all those 2 officers would do would be the first 2 officers to die, particularly against a well-planned terrorist attack. And of course that has the consequence that not only have I lost 2 officers, but a low sophistication attack could very rapidly become considerably more sophisticated. Taking the weapons from those officers would give a terrorist access to 2 submachine guns, 2 hand pistols, and around 300 rounds of ammunition, none of which is desirable. So I commissioned a review, and that was conducted over a number of months. And that review provided me really with 3 pieces of information which were helpful going forward. The first is that by conducting the review at all, embassies were aware of this activity. And of those 7 embassies, we quickly became aware of a sort of scale of their readiness to change. That we had embassies that were very open-minded to changing, and right up through to embassies that were fiercely resistant to anything other than 2 officers at the front of their embassy. And that very often was a matter of national ego as opposed to any security concerns. But that was useful information to have. I'm not going to tell you where Israel were, but they were not at either end of that scala. The second thing it told me was that nearly all embassy staff, in all cases, didn't use the front entrance of the embassy to access it or to leave it. And that meant, in my view, in the reviewing officers' view, left them very vulnerable. They were clearly identifiable as working at an embassy, and they were walking out of embassies onto the street with no protection at all before they could merge with the anonymity of a crowd. And the third thing it told me was that officers found themselves very often feeling threatened by members of the public in circumstances other than a terrorist attack. We conducted a review of all of the incursions that had occurred at all embassies over the previous 3 years. And statistically, that told us that the 2 most likely forms of incursion, of a breach of the security of an embassy, was somebody suffering from mental health issues or a concerted public protest over a specific issue that that country was currently engaged in. Nearly all incursions fell into those 2 categories. In UK policing, dealing with mental health and dealing with public protest are both environments in which we withdraw officers who are armed. It is not, in our model, desirable to have a large crowd very close to officers who have weapons. And so in almost all cases of those incursions, the armed officers at the front of the building were in fact withdrawn. So they weren't really performing any function at all. The review suggested a new tactic, and that tactic was, instead of having 7 embassies with 2 persons outside each one, but to have a mobile force, a dynamic security force of 14 officers armed in one vehicle, which was also carried additional weaponry, and that vehicle was deployed by a computer-generated random schedule across the 7 embassies. They would be deployed for somewhere between half an hour and an hour at each embassy, and that period was also random. And they weren't employed as perimeter guards. When they turned up at an embassy, they would deploy from the bus and they would conduct stop and search of individuals heading towards the embassy or past it. And likewise with vehicles, stopping and searching vehicles. They would also conduct a perimeter search of the embassy, both front and back, and also check all the alarms, as well as entering the embassy and speaking to members of staff inside to ensure they heard any concerns or intelligence reports since they were last there. We tested this and over a period of time, and it seemed to work. Officers felt very much more empowered by deploying in such a large force, and they felt that they were actually doing something as opposed to just being static guards. We then came to the really difficult bit, which was getting the engagement of the embassies, getting their agreement to change. And it was key to me that I didn't just want to be able to deliver this change and say that legally I've discharged my duty under the Vienna Convention. I wanted the embassies to feel safer. So I did what you would imagine I would do, which is I started with the easiest. And that nation had 2 premises close by to each other, and we delivered this tactic over a period of weeks. And we then surveyed the results. And staff at the embassies at that embassy were enormously positive about it. They felt considerably safer. They saw armed police engaged in security activity on entering and leaving the building. And they also got more engagement from officers, as they always went into the embassy to talk to them. That allowed me to use that information to sell the idea gradually moving up that scale of resistance until I'd landed it across all of the embassies that I was responsible for. It is true that on occasion static guards were still used depending on different threats as it altered from day to day, but that 14 strong force was also on top of that if it was required. It took months and years of work, it took an awful lot of diplomacy, but eventually we landed the idea, and I believe it delivered a more safe and secure environment for all of the embassies. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time, and that what I've said gives you something to think about and may spark an idea for you. Thank you for your time.